After Tufts University graduate student Rumeysa Ozturk was detained by plainclothes Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents earlier this week. Multiple Democratic members of Congress have called for her release. She's one of multiple high-profile cases of legal permanent residents or visa holders who have been detained by ICE after participating in pro-Palestinian protests or voicing those opinions online. According to the Associated Press, more than half a dozen people, many of whom are students or teachers at universities across the country, have been taken into custody, had their legal status revoked, or have been deported for voicing support for Palestinian causes. That includes Mahmoud Halil, a legal permanent resident who was a prominent figure during last year's protests on Columbia's campus against the Israel-Hamas war. Also detained in connection with those anti-war protests at Columbia is Leika Cordia, a Palestinian student who's accused of overstaying her F-1 visa, and Mamadou Tall, a British Gambian national and Cornell University doctoral student who had his visa revoked for his participation in what DHS officials call disruptive pro-Palestinian protests. The Trump administration has also targeted those participating in more recent protest actions. Yunseo Chung, a lawful U.S. resident and Columbia student, had her green card revoked after she was arrested at a sit-in last month at Barnard College to protest the school's expulsion of students who participated in protests. She's currently in hiding while her legal case makes its way through the court system. The Trump administration has also included in its sweep individuals who have voiced support for Palestinian causes online, as was the case with Badar Khan Suri, an Indian national who was a visiting scholar at Georgetown University on a student visa and married to an American citizen. He was detained on March 17th. His visa was revoked over accusations of spreading pro-Hamas rhetoric online, which he denies. Jessica Levinson joins us now. She's a CBS News contributor and a Loyola Law School professor. So, Jessica, can the government revoke a visa or green card because of political speech? What about due process?
What about due process? So I'll say what we're looking at is two competing concerns here. On the one hand, we have federal immigration law that sometimes on its face gives the executive pretty broad authority when it comes to things like national security, concerns about foreign nationals being in our country and potentially posing a threat. On the other hand, we have constitutional concerns about discriminating against any person. That includes citizens and non-citizens based on their viewpoint, based on their speech, based on their freedom of expression. We have concerns about harming people's due process rights. Again, that's notice and opportunity to be heard before the government takes away anybody's property or liberty. So we are kind of seeing, on the one hand, immigration law giving the executive really broad discretion. On the other hand, constitutional protections saying that's not unfettered discretion.
So do non-citizens, legal residents, people with student visas have First Amendment rights in the United States?
They do, because the First Amendment talks about people is understood to apply regardless of whether or not you are a citizen. There are some constitutional provisions that use the word citizen. There are others that use the word person. But when it comes to First Amendment rights, yes, if you are here and you, for instance, engage in a protest, you have First Amendment rights. Having said that, there are, again, these federal statutes under which people who are not citizens live under, and people who are not citizens are in this country as a matter of administrative grace, all of which is to say, absolutely, you have First Amendment protections. And in addition to that, there are certain restrictions in place based on your immigration status.
So I want to circle back to that in a second, but what rights do non-citizens have if they're detained after a protest?
So if non-citizens are detained after a protest, they would have the rights, one that we've been talking about, that claim that their First Amendment rights have been violated. If you are detained based on what you said, that looks like a First Amendment issue. If you are detained because the police said everybody, regardless of who you are or what you're saying, you need to clear out of this space, meaning if you are detained as a result of a content-neutral directive by the government, that would be different. Then you wouldn't have a First Amendment claim, at least not to the same extent. There are also, as we've been talking about, questions about due process concerns. If you are, again, detained after a protest, you can say, I was not given my constitutional rights of notice and an opportunity to be heard. That doesn't mean that you have an endless opportunity to be heard. It means there should be some process put in place generally speaking, before, for instance, your green card is taken away or your student visa is taken away.
So, for many, if not all these cases, the government is accusing protesters of supporting Hamas. Do they need to show specific evidence for that?
This is another great question. What the government needs, I think, is to show that this is not pretextual, right? One of the concerns we think about when we think about these immigration laws that, again, we've been talking about that do give the president, the secretary of state, other members of the executive branch a lot of authority, is that you don't just point to something like national security and say, see, there's a national security concern, that you don't, again, have just a pretextual reason. Having said that, the amount of proof, I think, is something that I hate to give this answer, but we're going to learn a bit more about in the next few weeks and months as we go through some of these cases and kind of sift through what judges will demand of the government.
So, with many of these broader issues, I'm going to ask you something. Do you think that this issue will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court?
It could. I mean, I know this is when it comes to so many of these executive actions that you and I have been talking about over the last few months, whether it be birthright citizenship or shutting down USAID or cutting funding to the Department of Education. I'm not mentioning basically dozens of other actions. The question is whether or not this will get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court typically takes cases when there's some sort of circuit split or when there's a big federal question, oftentimes of constitutional law. And I think what we've just talked about here is when questions about when federal immigration statutes apply, when they can be used, and then two, when First Amendment rights and due process rights are violated, which is all a long way of saying you absolutely could see cases like these land before the Supreme Court. We just don't know which ones and exactly when. And we, of course, need to remember that I think the Supreme Court docket could be filled with a lot of questions about executive power in the next few months and terms.
Certainly. Jessica Levinson, thank you as always.